The CFM 700 is a really special bicycle. It has no motor, no battery. It actually runs not on electricity, but on good old sandwiches. Still, it might be the most interesting bike test I've ever done. Hey guys, today's episode is going to be quite interesting because I've never done a test like this before. I've dealt with tons of bike tests, tested plenty of scooters, and even tested a skateboard, which you can see right there on the wall. But a bike with no motor that you pedal with your feet, now that's something I haven't tested yet. Moreover, the CFM 700C is a very special bike. It's a road bike, or as they say, it's a racing bike. And as amateurs would call it, it's got a super slim frame, really thin tires, and the entire bike is just very unique. In this video, I'm going to tell you what makes it so special and why this bike stands out. Before we dive into this, let's talk a bit about the unboxing and assembly. Then we'll cover a few basic specifications, as there's not much technical detail to go over. Finally, I'll share my experience using this bike. So, the unboxing. So the box is quite large, big enough to fit a large bicycle. When the courier delivered it, he mentioned he wasn't sure what it could be, because it's a really big box, but very light, as if there was nothing inside. And that's no surprise because it really is super lightweight, as I'll explain. As I mentioned, this bicycle weighs 9.2 kilograms, which is about the same as the box it comes in. The assembly doesn't take too long since there's not much to attach. We need to put on the front wheel, attach the handlebars, and install the saddle. The front brake, call it horseshoe brake or rim brake, whatever you prefer. All the other parts are installed, and not just installed, they're calibrated very precisely, very delicately, in a very specialized way. You don't have to do anything else, just take these things out of the box, put them on, tighten them up, and you're good to go. The brakes are perfectly adjusted, the gears are perfectly adjusted, everything's set. You can tell, by the way, that it was assembled at the factory, disassembled for shipping, since you can see wear marks on the stem clamp on the handlebars. It shows clearly that this bike was likely fully assembled on the production line. After the setup, it was taken apart so they could box it up and send it to them. So that's the assembly. Now we can jump straight to the exterior. But we also need to dive into the specifications right away, because the two can't really be separated. As I said, there's no electric motor, no battery, no need to discuss performance data or climbing ability or anything like that. There's no range anxiety because you're going to pedal it with your legs. So the only question is how much you ate beforehand, how much energy you have, and how well your legs, thighs and calves can handle the load. I can't really report on that. It's for you to decide. And if you buy a bike like this, you'll ride it and find out how much strength you have. So, the specifications, the most important thing about this bicycle, and I really believe there's nothing more important, is that this is a carbon frame bicycle. What does a carbon frame mean? A carbon frame means they take carbon fiber, resin, high temperature, vacuum, and create a frame that is a tube frame. In reality, it is much lighter, about 10 to 15% lighter than an aluminum frame of the same size. Plus it is less rigid than an aluminum frame. These are its advantages. It also has some disadvantages, because if a carbon frame gets damaged, cracks or breaks, it is very hard or almost impossible to repair, so that's a downside. Even so, they often say that carbon frame bicycles are much better because they vibrate less, absorb road imperfections better, and are therefore more comfortable to ride. They're really good because they're much lighter than a traditional aluminum frame bicycle. So, if you ride a lot, and at high speeds, a carbon frame bicycle has many advantages. The construction of this bike is completely traditional, assembled from two triangles. Not only is the frame made of carbon, but the front fork is also made of carbon, as well as the other components, and the seat post as well. According to factory data, the frame weighs just 1100 grams, the front fork is about 400 grams, and the seat post is roughly 130 grams, if my memory serves me right. So, it's not too heavy. As I mentioned, the entire bicycle, with wheels, gears, seat, everything, weighs 9.2 kilograms, which means I can easily lift it with one hand. Even my sons, who are 6 years old, can lift the bike with both hands without any problem. What's interesting about it is that it doesn't have the familiar European parts. So you won't find Shimano gears on this bike, for instance, which is not a big deal because Chinese manufacturers love to put Shimano on their electric bikes just so they can advertise it as Shimano, because the Tony is a very, very cheap entry-level solution. For an electric bike, a bike with a rear hub motor, it's perfectly adequate because the torque is mostly provided not through the pedals and chain by your legs, but by the rear hub motor. It adds to the progress. So even if the gears are slightly lower quality, it's not a problem. They won't wear out too quickly and they won't break down too fast. So these Tony shifters are perfectly suitable for these e-bikes. Exactly enough. Yes, but if you want to buy a regular pedal bike, then it's definitely not worth picking from the bottom shelf, and you'd better put on some decent quality parts. For example, you should understand that there's the gear mechanism manufactured by a company called LCU. They specialize in regular pedal bikes, and if you want to buy a regular pedal bike, it's not worth picking from the bottom shelf. Go for some decent quality parts. If you want to buy a pedal-powered bike, it's really not worth choosing from the lower shelf. It's better to get some proper quality components for it. However, they don't deal with entry-level systems, but they make mid-range and high-end gear systems. What you see on this bike is roughly mid-range within their products. Among mechanical arrangements, this is the R7 series. It's worth checking out the manufacturer's website and their product catalog. Very, very professional and really good stuff. So the point is that on this CFM 700C bicycle, we have mid-range components, which are at the top of the mid-range within the manufacturer's offerings, which is really good. Just so you know where to place this price-wise. If you check on AliExpress, which is a relatively cheap source, the complete gear set with levers, cogs, everything, costs 75,000 forints, which, spoiler alert, is almost a third of the total price of the bike. So, you could say that by Chinese standards, it's relatively good, but perhaps even by European standards, it's considered pretty good. Another interesting thing about this bike is that it doesn't have the currently trendy disc brakes, but the older, well-proven caliper or rim brakes, whichever you prefer to call them. In my opinion, this isn't a problem because it makes maintenance much simpler. The maintenance takes much longer before the brake pads wear out, and in my opinion, the effectiveness isn't a big issue, at least not for the level at which you and I will be using it. Another thing to know is that mid and high-end manufacturers make the cables that have been used for the housing. Likewise, the same manufacturer makes the tires, both the outer and the inner. So you could say that this bike is assembled from pretty solid mid-range components, even if all the manufacturers are Chinese. We have to get used to this because, for example, among cars we can also find many Chinese manufacturers. And in terms of quality, these manufacturers sometimes produce slightly better than Europeans. The names of the manufacturers might still be a bit peculiar, but we'll gradually get used to this as well. So regarding specifications, the main point is, this is a very, very excellent mid to upper mid-range carbon bike. But let's move on to how it was to ride this bicycle. Well, I have to say there hasn't been a test yet where a bike arrived, and within the first 1 to 2 weeks, I would have ridden over 200 kilometers, because I simply don't normally have time for this. But with this bike, I definitely wanted to make time and ride enough so I could tell you how well it worked. Because the truth is, I actually bought this bike for myself. I bought it to change my lifestyle a bit and get a little more exercise because I sit a lot due to my work. So, I bought this bike for myself. It arrived about 2 weeks ago. And in these 2 weeks, I've already ridden roughly 250 kilometers. The longest distance I rode was about 50 kilometers. The shortest was about 30 kilometers. I rode at about 60 kilometers per hour, and I also climbed the highest point here in Egerseg. Well, it's not really a huge mountain, because from my starting point, I had to climb roughly 150 meters up. So I did what I could, tried everything I could. As I mentioned, right after setup, during the first tests, it was already noticeable how smoothly the shifting works and how well it is adjusted with the factory settings. I must say, I did not need to touch them in the past 2 weeks, so the adjustment set by the factory with which I received the bike has been perfect since. However, the bike is not flawless, and there are actually 2 very tiny things that I adjusted. I could point out some flaws. One is that they put a frame guard, a Velcro frame guard, on the side of the chain. Its purpose is that when, for example, you jump off a curb and the chain snaps back because of the shifting, it hits the frame so that the frame does not get damaged. This would be really useful if it wasn't for this Velcro junk they put on it. The problem is that the rear triangle is thicker towards the pedal and narrows towards the wheel, which is completely normal. So the issue is when you put on this Velcro frame protector, it won't move in the thick direction, but it will move towards the rear wheel, not the pedal. And at the rear wheel, there are the gears, and that's where the rebellious force is. And I noticed on my second test ride that the chain started to grind down this frame protector. Luckily, it didn't get caught, it didn't wrap around, and didn't jam into the chainring or the chain, because if it had, I would have had a crash. And for sure, I wouldn't be able to film this show for you now. So I suggest you, if you buy this bike, throw this good-looking, seemingly useful, but extremely dangerous frame protector far away. The other problem I have is with the pedal, but it's not really the bike's fault, it's mine. I ride quite a bit, and I realized that the pedal they put on this bike, though it's a relatively good quality metal pedal, is not suitable for longer distances. To go with it, because honestly, I sometimes have to pedal so hard that my feet go numb, and that's not a good feeling. I think it's really positive that I've only encountered these 2 issues in the past 2 weeks, and over 250 kilometers ridden. One thing we still need to discuss is the price of the bike, because this bicycle was made for 277,000 forints brand new. This 277,000 forints in Hungary is the price of an entry-level or mid-range aluminum frame bike without extras, or even less. And because of this, it's a little strange that it's possible to get a carbon frame bike from China for the same price or less. So the situation is that you can find this bicycle not only in Chinese stores, but also in European stores. And interestingly, in European stores, it's no longer 277,000 forints. The prices I saw online ranged between 1,300 and 1,400 euros, which translates to somewhere around 500,000 to 550,000 forints. This is the current realistic price in Europe for such a carbon frame bicycle. So if you buy this bike from a European store, then you can get it for around 1,300 to 1,400 euros. And you won't be surprised by how cheap it is. So the point is, the price isn't low because the bike is bad, but because we're buying it from a Chinese distributor and not a European one. One more thing about the price. Many people have asked if it might make sense to get a used bicycle for a similar price. And they do have a point, since I checked out used bicycles to see roughly how much a carbon bike costs. Various cheaper mid-range models with Shimano parts and similar equipment to this bike. Well, you can get a similarly equipped but used carbon bike for around 330,000 to 350,000 forints. What's the problem with that? And why did I choose this bike even though it's a Chinese bike? Well, it's very simple. Because when I buy a used bike or anything else, I don't know who used it, I don't know how they used it, and I don't know how much they used it. You can say anything. They might say they rode it for 2,000 kilometers, and maybe they actually rode it for 20,000 kilometers. They might say it was very gently used by a non-smoking country doctor, when in fact it was a road racing bike used by someone who pushed it to its limits. Unfortunately, with a carbon frame, it can happen that the high load damages the frame, causing microcracks inside that can only be detected with an endoscope, and even then it is difficult. So, if you buy a used carbon bike and you don't get it from a reliable source, where you know for sure that it is a well-maintained bike, you might get into trouble because you could end up buying an overused, worn-out, beat-up bike that could break down after riding just 200 to 500 kilometers. This doesn't mean that every used bike sold this way has these issues. You might get lucky. I'm just saying, that the only sure thing is the one you unpack, put together, and ride from 0 kilometers. Even this is not 100% obvious, but there is a much higher chance of getting a good quality, non-worn out, non-defective bicycle if you don't. So the CFM 700C was made for me now. Now it's the peak. I love it. I ride it a lot. I already know all its little noises, and I know very well that if it ever starts to rattle, click, or pop a little, if there's some small sound change, I will know where to fix it. Everything is simple to adjust on it, so good. I really like it. And in 2 weeks, I've really grown to love this bike. So this one is staying with me. And from now on, this will be my bike, the one I will keep in shape with. So, this video is pretty much it. I can't say more about it. I hope I was convincing and you believe me on how great this bike is. The main thing is that there will be a link under the video on YouTube, as usual, where you can buy it. And also there will be a coupon code so you can get it for the price of 277,000 forints. They ship from a local warehouse, so it's quick and you can start riding soon. Well, for this year, the bike and scooter tests are most likely over because autumn has arrived and manufacturers slow down production. If everything goes well, I will be back next spring with more articles and tests, and if I can, I might try to get some regular pedal bikes to test too, because I really want to do that. I'll be back next week with another test, this time about a car gadget. Until then, be good and take care. Goodbye.